January 17, 1943. A makeshift American field hospital, 30 kilometers west of Stalingrad. The wind carried ash. The canvas walls of the tent shuddered under the Siberian gale. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of antiseptic, blood, and something else. Coffee. Real coffee, the kind that hadn't been brewed from acorns or chicory root. A young German soldier, his left leg wrapped in clean white bandages that seemed impossibly bright against the grime of his torn uniform, lay on a cot that didn't collapse beneath his weight. His name was Unteroffizier Klaus Hartmann, and for the first time in 4 months, he was warm outside. The Eastern Front was devouring the 6th Army inside. An American medic, a farm boy from Iowa who never heard of Stalingrad until 6 months ago, was checking his pulse with hands that didn't shake from cold or hunger. The medic wrote something on a clipboard. Klaus watched him. The medic's uniform was intact. His face was clean. When he moved, his boots didn't leave bloody prints on the frozen ground. Klaus realized, with a clarity that cut through the morphine, that he had crossed into another world entirely. This was not supposed to happen. German soldiers were not supposed to end up in American care on the Eastern Front in early 1943. The Americans were not yet deeply entrenched in the European theater that would come later. After North Africa, after Sicily, after the long crawl up Italy's spine. But war creates strange geometries. A forward American medical observation unit, attached to Soviet forces as part of the Lend-Lease liaison program, had been positioned near the outer encirclements of Stalingrad. Their mission was to assess medical supply needs and train Soviet medics in advanced triage techniques developed in American hospitals. They were not supposed to treat German prisoners, but when the Soviets brought in a truckload of captured enemy wounded, barely alive, frozen to the point where their blood moved like oil, the American commander made a decision. Medicine, he said, doesn't have a nationality. Klaus Hartmann had been taught otherwise. For 5 years, since he'd been 17, he'd been taught that the world was divided into superior and inferior, that medicine itself could be weaponized, that mercy was a bourgeois weakness. He'd stood in formations in Munich and listened to speeches about the destiny of the Aryan race. He'd marched through Poland and France with the certainty of conquest. He crossed into the Soviet Union in June of 1941 believing he would be home by Christmas. He believed in the invincibility of German arms, the efficiency of German logistics, the superiority of German will. Stalingrad had taught him differently. Stalingrad had taught him that winter was older than ideology, that hunger was a more ancient force than politics, that cold didn't care about the color of your uniform. The encirclement had begun in November. The Soviet pincers had closed around the 6th Army like a bear trap. 300,000 men, the pride of the Wehrmacht, suddenly found themselves in a pocket that grew smaller each day. The Luftwaffe promised supplies. The supplies didn't come, or came in quantities so small they might as well have been insults. 50 grams of bread per day, then 30, then nothing. Men boiled their leather belts and ate the soup. They burned books for warmth. They wrapped their feet in newspaper and watched their toes turn black. Klaus had been wounded during a Soviet counterattack on January 12th. Shrapnel from a Katyusha rocket had torn through his leg and fractured his femur. He'd lain in a bombed-out factory for 2 days, sharing space with corpses that no one had the strength to move. When the Soviets came through on their sweep, they found him barely conscious. A Red Army lieutenant, following new orders about the treatment of prisoners, had him loaded onto a truck with other survivors. The lieutenant was following instructions from high command, demonstrate to the world that the Soviet Union, unlike the fascist invaders, adhered to the Geneva Convention. The optics mattered. The world was watching, but it was the Americans who actually delivered the care. The Soviet field hospitals were overwhelmed, undersupplied, brutal in their efficiency. The wounded who could walk were patched and sent to POW camps. Those who couldn't were left to the mercy of overworked Soviet surgeons with limited anesthesia and even less sympathy. The American unit, with its abundance of supplies and its fresh-faced medics who still believed in textbook procedures, became an accidental sanctuary. Klaus woke fully on his second day in the tent. The first thing he noticed was the silence. Not complete silence, there were voices, the clank of metal instruments, the hiss of a gas heater, but the absence of screaming. In the German aid stations, men screamed. They screamed because there was no morphine. They screamed because the surgeons cut without anesthetic. They screamed because screaming was the only response left to them. Here, men didn't scream. He saw other wounded Soviets, mostly, but also a few Germans like himself. They lay on cots with clean sheets. They received injections that made their faces go slack with relief. They were fed soup that had meat in it. Actual meat. Klaus couldn't remember the last time he'd eaten meat that hadn't been carved from a frozen horse. A nurse approached his cot. She was Russian, working with the American team, and she held a tray with soup and a piece of bread. White bread. Klaus stared at it. The bread alone represented more calories than he consumed in a week. She set the tray on a small table beside his cot and said something in Russian he didn't understand. Then she smiled. It was a professional smile, the kind nurses everywhere are taught to deploy. But it shattered something in Klaus's chest. No one had smiled at him in months. He ate slowly. His stomach had shrunk. The soup was warm and tasted like civilization. The bread was soft. He held it in his hands and felt the weight of it, the substance. In Stalingrad, men had killed each other for bread. He'd seen it. A corporal from Hamburg had beaten a private to death with a frozen log over a crust, the size of a playing card. The corporal had been executed the next day, but it hadn't mattered. They'd all understood. Hunger turns men into something else. The American medic returned. His name tag read Thompson. He checked Klaus's leg, changed the dressing with practiced efficiency, and made notes on his chart. Klaus watched him work. Thompson's hands were steady. His fingernails were clean. He wore a wristwatch that still worked. These small details accumulated in Klaus's mind like evidence in a trial. This was a soldier from an army that had not forgotten how to be human. Klaus had heard about American abundance. Everyone in the Wehrmacht had heard the stories. The officers joked about it. American soldiers who complained if they didn't get ice cream with their meals. American units that received fresh fruit and Coca-Cola at the front. It had been presented to them as decadence, as proof of American softness. The German soldier was hard, they were told. He could endure what the American could not. He could march farther on less food. He could fight longer in worse conditions. This hardness was what would win the war. But lying in that tent, eating soup that had real vegetables in it, Klaus began to understand a different mathematics. Hardness born of deprivation was not the same as strength born of abundance. A soldier who was warm, fed, and healthy fought better than a soldier who was cold, starving, and sick. This was not complicated. This was not ideological. This was simply true. On his third day, Klaus witnessed something that would define the rest of his life. An American doctor, a major, tall and lanky, with a drawl that suggested the American South, came through the tent on rounds. He stopped at each bed. He spoke to each patient. When he reached the German wounded, he didn't skip them. He didn't spit at them or curse them. He examined their wounds with the same care he gave to everyone else. When he reached Klaus, he looked at the chart and nodded. "You're healing well," he said in heavily accented German. "Legs should be fine if we can prevent infection. You're lucky." Lucky. The word was absurd. Klaus had been shot, frozen, captured, and was now a prisoner of war in the bloodiest conflict in human history. But the doctor was right. He was lucky. Lucky to be in this tent instead of dying in a frozen trench. Lucky to have morphine instead of screaming through an amputation. Lucky to be treated by people who still believe that even enemies deserve medicine. The doctor moved on. Klaus watched him stop at the next cot, where a Soviet soldier with a chest wound lay struggling to breathe. The doctor called for oxygen and stayed with the man until his breathing steadied. Then he moved to a German corporal with frostbite so severe that his fingers had turned black. The doctor examined the fingers with a frown and called for the surgeon. The corporal would lose those fingers, but he would live. Klaus realized something in that moment. The doctor didn't see Germans or Soviets. He saw wounds. He saw broken bodies that needed fixing. This was radical. This was not how the world worked in 1943. The world in 1943 was organized around tribal loyalty, around flags and uniforms and anthems. But inside this tent, a different principle governed. The principle was older than nationalism. It was the idea that suffering deserved relief regardless of who was suffering. He thought about the lectures he'd attended in his training. The medical officers had explained the hierarchy of care. Germans first, Allied collaborators second, neutral civilians if resources permitted, enemy combatants last, if at all. The Hippocratic Oath was fine in theory, they said, but war required priorities. German medicine served German interests. This was scientific. This was rational. But watching the American doctor work, Klaus saw the flaw in that logic. Medicine that served ideology wasn't medicine anymore. It was just another weapon. And weapons, eventually, turn on their wielders. Over the following days, Klaus healed. His fever broke. The infection that had threatened his leg retreated. Under the assault of antibiotics, real antibiotics. Not the ersatz German compounds that worked half the time. He began to sit up. He began to talk with the other wounded Germans in the tent. There were 7 of them. A sergeant from Dresden. A private from Berlin. A lance corporal who'd been a teacher in Hamburg before the war. They spoke in whispers at first, unsure whether conversation was permitted. No one stopped them. The nurses came and went. The American medics made their rounds. No one interrogated them. No one beat them. No one screamed about ideology or duty. The sergeant, whose name was Werner, had been in the Wehrmacht since 1936. He fought in Poland, France, and the Soviet Union. He believed in the mission. He believed in the Führer. But now, lying in a cot with a bullet wound in his shoulder that had been properly cleaned and sutured, he spoke differently. They have everything, he said one night, his voice barely audible over the sound of the wind outside. Did you see the supply truck today? It was full. Medicine, food, blankets, full. When did we last see a supply truck that was full? Klaus had seen it. An American transport had arrived that morning, and medics had unloaded crate after crate of supplies, bandages, plasma, canned food. There was no frantic rationing, no desperate calculations about who would receive care and who wouldn't. There was simply enough. It's not just supplies, the private from Berlin said. His name was Otto, and he was 19. He'd been conscripted 8 months ago. It's the way they are. Did you see them laughing today? When was the last time you saw German soldiers laugh? It was true. The American medics joked with each other. They smiled. They moved through their work with a lightness that seemed impossible given the circumstances. They were in the middle of a war zone, surrounded by death and suffering. But they hadn't been consumed by it. They maintained some inner reserve of humanity that the German army had systematically stripped from its soldiers. Klaus thought about his own journey to the Eastern Front, the speeches, the songs, the endless emphasis on duty and sacrifice, strength through suffering, victory through will. They'd been conditioned to accept deprivation as virtue, to see hardship as proof of superiority. And it had worked for a while. But hardship alone doesn't win wars. Resources win wars. Logistics win wars. An economy that can produce enough medicine and food and bullets for its soldiers wins wars. On his 7th day in the tent, Klaus made a decision. When the American doctor came through on rounds, Klaus spoke. I don't want to leave, he said in halting English he'd learned in school. The doctor stopped. He looked at Klaus with an expression that mixed surprise and sadness. I understand, the doctor said slowly. But you're a prisoner of war. You'll be transferred to a POW camp once you're stable. That's the protocol. I know, Klaus said. But I want to stay. Here. I want to work. I can help. I was training to be a medic before. He gestured vaguely at his leg, at the tent. At the war outside, the doctor considered this. He called over a nurse and spoke with her in English to wrap it for Klaus to follow. The nurse looked at Klaus and nodded. The doctor turned back. I'll see what I can do, he said. No promises. The request was unusual, but not unprecedented. As the war progressed, some German Pows were employed in labor roles in Allied camps, including medical facilities. They were still prisoners, but they were useful prisoners. and usefulness in the calculus of war, bought small privileges. 3 days later, Klaus was moved, not to a POW camp, but to a larger American medical facility that had been established in a commandeered Soviet school building. His leg was still healing, but he could walk with crutches. He was assigned to work under supervision in the supply room, organizing medicines and bandages, learning the American system of inventory and distribution. It was here, in the mundane routine of counting morphine ampules and folding gauze, that Klaus began to understand the true gulf between the armies. The American supply system was a revelation. Everything was labeled. Everything was tracked. There were redundancies built into redundancies. If one shipment was delayed, another would arrive. There was no panic, no desperation. The abundance wasn't accidental. It was engineered. He learned that American factories were producing war materials on a scale that defied comprehension. That American logistics could deliver those materials across oceans and continents. That American soldiers received pay, leave, letters from home, hot food, medical care, and the assumption that their lives had value beyond their immediate utility as fighters. This last point haunted him. In the Wehrmacht, soldiers were expendable. This was implicit in every order, every speech, every tactical decision. Units were sacrificed to buy time. Men were left behind because retreat was more important than rescue. The individual soldier mattered only insofar as he contributed to the collective goal. His life had no intrinsic worth, but the American system operated differently. Every wounded American soldier received maximum effort at rescue and treatment. Medics risked their lives to reach wounded men. Field hospitals were positioned as close to the front as safety permitted. Plasma and morphine were distributed generously, not hoarded. The assumption was that each soldier's life was worth the effort to save. This wasn't sentimentality. It was policy. And policy reflected values. Klaus worked in that supply room for 3 weeks. He learned English from the medics. He learned the difference between sulfa drugs and penicillin. He learned how to sterilize instruments properly, how to organize a medical inventory, how to anticipate supply needs based on casualty projections. He also learned, through observation and conversation, about the country that had produced this system. One of the medics, a corporal from Minnesota named Jensen, liked to talk. During breaks, he would sit with Klaus and describe America. Jensen's father owned a hardware store. Jensen had 3 sisters and a younger brother. Before the war, he'd been planning to attend university on a scholarship. He described a place where people voted for their leaders, where newspapers criticized the government openly, where you could own land and build a business and say what you wanted. Without fear of midnight arrests, Klaus listened to these descriptions, with the skepticism of someone who'd been trained to recognize propaganda. But the physical evidence was harder to dismiss. The letters Jensen received from Home Weekly, sometimes twice weekly, talked about family dinners and church socials, and high school basketball games. They were mundane. They were boring. They described a world where normal life continued even while war raged overseas. The German home front had become a place of total mobilization, where every resource and every person was dedicated to the war effort. The American home front, apparently, still had space for basketball games. "Don't you think it's unfair?" Klaus asked one day. They were sitting outside the supply room, smoking cigarettes, American cigarettes, which came in neat packages and didn't require you to roll your own. You are here. They are home, living normal lives. Jensen thought about this. "I guess," he said. "But that's kind of the point, isn't it? We're fighting so they can keep living normal lives. So the war doesn't come home. That's what freedom means. People get to just live." The statement was simple. It was almost naive, but it contained a logic that Klaus hadn't considered. In Germany, the war had consumed everything. There was no aspect of life that wasn't militarized, no space that wasn't occupied by the demands of the state. This had been presented to them as strength, as national unity. But maybe it was actually weakness. Maybe a system that required total mobilization was a system that couldn't sustain itself. He thought about the coffee. In the American facility, there was always coffee. Real coffee, brewed fresh every morning. The medics drank it casually, sometimes pouring out half a cup if it got cold. Klaus had watched a medic pour cold coffee down a sink once and nearly gasped aloud. In Stalingrad, men had killed for less. But here, coffee was so abundant that waste was permissible. The coffee became, in Klaus's mind, a symbol of everything that separated the two systems. One side was desperately conserving resources, stretching every gram of ersatz flour into another day of survival. The other side had so much that it could afford to be wasteful. The coffee wasn't magic. It came from American economic power, from trade networks that spanned the globe, from agricultural systems that produced surplus, from ships that could transport goods across oceans. But to Klaus, lying awake at night in the barracks where recovered POWs were housed, the coffee represented something more profound. It represented a civilization that hadn't bet everything on one apocalyptic struggle. It represented a society that still had reserves. By late February, Klaus was walking without crutches. His leg had healed remarkably well. The American doctors said he'd limp for the rest of his life, but he'd have function. He would walk. He would live. The question became, what would happen to him next? The standard procedure was transfer to a permanent POW camp. In his case, likely a camp in the Soviet Union, where conditions were harsh and survival was uncertain, or possibly transfer to American custody, which would mean eventual transport to the United States to sit out the rest of the war. In comparative comfort, Klaus petitioned to stay. He wrote a letter to the facility commander, a full colonel from Texas who'd been a hospital administrator before the war. In the letter, Klaus explained that he had medical training, that he could be useful, that he understood the American system now and could work effectively within it. He didn't say what he was really asking for, asylum from the future, from the reckoning he knew was coming. The colonel called him in for an interview. They sat in a small office that smelled of dust and old paper. The colonel read through Klaus's letter again, then looked at him over the rim of reading glasses. "Why do you want to stay here?" the colonel asked in English. Klaus's English had improved enough to understand. "Because here I am human," Klaus replied. "Here I am not just a number in a formation." The colonel leaned back in his chair. "You understand that Germany is losing this war," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Klaus said, "and you understand that when it's over, there will be a reckoning for what your country did, for the camps, for the atrocities." Klaus hadn't known about the camps, not in detail. Information had been controlled, rumors dismissed as enemy propaganda, but he'd seen enough in the East, the burned villages, the mass executions of partisans and civilians, the casual cruelty that had become routine to know that something monstrous had been unleashed. He nodded. "I cannot undo what was done," Klaus said slowly. "I can only choose what I do now." The colonel studied him for a long moment. Then he said, "You know what I think. I think you boys were fed a lie. You were told you were superior, that you had a right to rule, that might makes right. And you believed it because you were young and scared and it felt good to believe. You were part of something great. But now you've seen what that lie costs. You've seen what happens when a nation decides that some people matter and others don't." Klaus said nothing. There was nothing to say. The colonel was right. "I'll approve your request," the colonel said finally. "You can stay on as medical support staff. You'll still be a POW. You'll still be supervised. But you can work. And when this war is over, maybe you can go home and tell people what you learned here." Klaus was assigned to the recovery ward. He helped with basic patient care, changing bandages, distributing medications, assisting with meals. He worked alongside American medics and Russian nurses and even, occasionally, other German POWs who'd been cleared for work duty. The work was simple, but it was steady. It was purposeful. And every day, he saw the evidence of a system that valued human life not as a means to an end, but as an end in itself. He saw American medics stay up through the night with a dying Soviet soldier, holding his hand, speaking to him in broken Russian, making sure he didn't die alone. He saw a German corporal, captured and wounded, receive the same surgery that an American officer would receive. He saw resources precious, expensive resources deployed generously to save lives that had no strategic value. This generosity was strategic, of course. Treating Poles well was good propaganda. It encouraged surrender. It demonstrated the moral superiority of the Allied cause. But Klaus came to believe that it was more than calculation. It reflected a foundational belief that even enemies were human, that even in war, certain lines shouldn't be crossed. That mercy wasn't weakness. In April, news reached the facility that the 6th Army at Stalingrad had surrendered. 91,000 survivors, out of 300,000 who'd been encircled. The rest were dead, frozen, starved, killed in combat. Klaus learned that his unit had been wiped out. Everyone he'd known, his commanding officer, his friends, the men he'd trained with, were gone. He'd survived because he'd been wounded at exactly the right moment, captured by exactly the right unit, transferred to exactly the right facility. He thought about probability, about luck, about the razor-thin margin between life and death. If the Soviet lieutenant had followed different orders, Klaus would have been left in that factory to freeze. If the Americans hadn't been attached to that sector, he'd have been treated in a Soviet field hospital with its brutal efficiency. If he'd been treated at all, if his wound had been slightly different, higher, lower, deeper, he'd have died before capture. Every step of his survival had been contingent, accidental, impossible to predict. But maybe that was the point. War was chaos. War was randomness. And the only way to preserve humanity in chaos was to create systems that protected life as a default, not as an exception. The American medical system wasn't perfect. Men still died. Resources were still limited. Triage still meant choosing who to save and who to let go. But the baseline assumption was that life was worth saving, that effort was worth making, that the individual mattered. Klaus stayed in the American facility through the spring and summer of 1943. He watched the war turn. He heard about Allied victories in North Africa, about the invasion of Sicily, about Soviet advances in the East. He knew, with increasing certainty, that Germany would lose. And he was glad, not because he hated his country, but because he'd seen what his country had become. He'd seen the ideology eaten to its core, and the core was hollowed out. In September, he was transferred, not to a camp, but to another American medical facility, this one in Italy, where the invasion was underway. The Americans were expanding their operations, and they needed experienced medical support staff. Klaus, now fluent in English and familiar with American procedures, was valuable. He remained a POW, but his status was increasingly ambiguous. He wore a uniform that identified him as German, but he worked alongside Americans as a colleague, not an enemy. The facility in Italy was larger, more permanent. It treated American casualties from the fighting in the mountains, Italian partisans, German POWs, and civilians caught in the crossfire. Klaus worked in the surgery prep room. He learned to anticipate what surgeons would need, to prepare instruments, to maintain sterile fields. He learned from American doctors who trained at Johns Hopkins and Harvard, who discussed cases with the intellectual rigor of people who believed medicine was a science that could be perfected. One day, in the break room, he sat with a group of American medics and doctors. They were talking about home. One of the doctors, a captain from Philadelphia, described his practice before the war. He'd specialized in pediatrics. He talked about vaccinating children against polio and measles, about well-baby checkups, about a healthcare system that assumed children deserved preventive care. It's not perfect. The doctor said, there's poverty, there's inequality, but the idea is there that a civilized society takes care of its people. That health isn't a luxury. That kid shouldn't die from preventable diseases. Klaus listened. He thought about the German healthcare system before the war, which had been advanced, comprehensive. But then he thought about the rhetoric that had accompanied the war, the emphasis on racial purity, the TIFA program that had murdered disabled children and adults. Because they were deemed life unworthy of life, medicine had been weaponized, turned into a tool of eugenic ideology. The idea that health was a universal right had been abandoned in favor of the idea that only the strong, the pure, the racially acceptable deserved care. In Germany, Klaus said slowly, we forgot that. We forgot that medicine is for everyone. The doctor looked at him. "That's why you'll rebuild," he said. "After the war, you'll remember, the war in Europe ground on." Klaus worked through 1944 and into 1945. He saw the casualty list grow longer. He saw the faces of American soldiers change as the fighting intensified in France, then Germany. He saw German POWs arrive in increasing numbers, many of them boys barely old enough to shave, conscripted in the desperate final stages of the war. He saw their shock when they received the same care as American wounded. He saw them struggle with the same cognitive dissonance he'd experienced in May 1945. Germany surrendered. The news came through on the radio. The war in Europe was over. Klaus was 31 years old. He'd spent 6 years at war, 2 of them as a POW working in American medical facilities. He'd survived when most of his comrades hadn't, and now he had to figure out what came next. The process of repatriation began. German POWs were organized into groups for transport back to Germany. But Germany was destroyed. Cities were rubble. The economy was collapsed. Millions were displaced. The occupation had begun, and the country was divided into sectors controlled by the Allies. The future was uncertain. Klaus was given a choice. He could return to Germany immediately, or he could volunteer to stay and work with the Allied occupation forces as medical support staff. The job would be temporary, but it would give him employment, food, housing, and a small salary. He could help rebuild. He chose to stay. He was assigned to an American military hospital in Frankfurt. The city was devastated, but the hospital was functional. It treated American occupation troops, German civilians, and displaced persons from across Europe. Klaus worked there for 2 years. He saw Germany at its lowest point. He saw hunger and despair and the slow, painful process of reconstruction. But he also saw something else. He saw Americans who genuinely wanted to help, who believed that even former enemies deserved a chance to rebuild their lives. The Marshall Plan was announced. American aid began flowing into Western Europe: food, medicine, raw materials, investment. It was abundance on a scale that seemed impossible. Klaus watched as the same generosity he'd experienced in that field hospital tent in 1943 was extended to an entire continent. This wasn't altruism. It was strategy. The Americans wanted stable, prosperous allies to counter Soviet influence. But strategy and morality aren't mutually exclusive. The help was real. In 1947, Klaus was officially released from POW status. He was a free man. He'd saved enough money to enroll in medical school. The German university system was struggling to reopen, but it was happening. Students returned to classrooms. Professors who'd survived the war came back to teach. The books that had been burned were reprinted. Knowledge began to flow again. Klaus studied medicine properly this time, not as a military medic learning to patch wounds efficiently, but as a physician learning to understand the human body, to diagnose disease, to promote health. He graduated in 1952. He opened a practice in a small town in Bavaria. He treated everyone who came through his door: old Nazis, former soldiers, refugees, displaced persons. He didn't ask about their pasts. He treated their illnesses. He never forgot the coffee. On his desk, in his clinic, he kept a small tin of American coffee beans. He didn't drink it often. It was expensive, imported, but it sat there as a reminder that abundance was possible, that systems could be built to protect rather than destroy, that even in the darkest times, some people chose mercy. The coffee represented something that couldn't be quantified in military terms. It represented surplus, reserve, the capacity to be generous because you weren't desperate. The German war machine had been built on deprivation dressed up as virtue, on the idea that hardship created strength. But hardship had only created more hardship. Desperation had led to atrocity. The logic of scarcity had ended in ovens and mass graves. The Americans had shown him a different logic. Not the logic of plenty. America had problems, inequalities, its own dark chapters, but the logic of enough. Enough food so that soldiers didn't starve. Enough medicine so that wounded men received care. Enough confidence in the system so that even enemies could be treated humanely. Without threatening the war effort, Klaus lived to see Germany rebuild. He lived to see the economic miracle of the 1950s, the integration into NATO, the slow process of denazification and truth-telling. He lived to see his country become a democracy, imperfect but functional. He lived to see young Germans who'd never known war, who took peace and prosperity for granted, who couldn't imagine what their grandparents had experienced. He told his stories sometimes. When asked, not often, he wasn't proud of having served in the Wehrmacht, even if he'd been young and hadn't fully understood what he was part of. But when he spoke, he emphasized the moment of transformation, the moment in that tent when he'd been treated as a human being by people he'd been taught to consider inferior, the moment when he'd realized that the ideology he'd been fed was a lie, and that the truth was simpler and more profound, that humanity transcends nationality, that mercy is strength, and that abundance shared is better than scarcity hoarded. In 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell and Germany began the process of reunification, Klaus was 75 years old. He watched on television as crowds celebrated in the streets of Berlin. He thought about the long arc of history, about how the choices made in 1945 had shaped everything that followed. The Americans could have been vengeful. They could have imposed harsh terms, stripped Germany of its industry, left the population to starve. Instead, they'd offered a path back to civilization. They bet that former enemies could become allies. That investment in peace was better than the satisfaction of revenge. The bet had paid off. Germany had become one of the strongest economies in Europe, a stable democracy, a valued partner in the Atlantic Alliance. None of that had been inevitable. It had required choices, American choices to be generous, German choices to accept help and rebuild honestly, collective choices to prioritize peace over grievance. Klaus died in 1994. He was 80 years old. He lived long enough to see the Cold War end, to see Europe unite, to see the long shadow of World War to finally begin to fade. He lived a quiet life, a country doctor, a husband, a father of 3, a grandfather of 7. He'd never been famous. He'd never done anything that would make it into history books. But he carried with him, every day, the memory of that moment in January 1943 when he'd been treated with mercy by people who had every reason to hate him, and he passed that memory on to his children, to his patients, to anyone who asked. He told them that freedom wasn't just a political system. It was a practice. It was the daily choice to see other people as fully human, deserving of dignity and care. It was the abundance that allowed for generosity. It was the coffee that was always there, brewed fresh, taken for granted, representing a world where needs could be met and people could be trusted to do the right thing without being forced. The story of Klaus Hartmann wasn't exceptional. Thousands of German Poles passed through American medical facilities during and after World War II. Many had similar experiences of shock and transformation. Many carried similar memories. But his story mattered because it illustrated a truth about the war that isn't captured in the accounts of battles and strategies. The war was won not just by superior firepower or better tactics, but by superior systems of production, of logistics, of care. The American advantage wasn't racial or ideological. It was systemic. It was the advantage of a society that had built institutions capable of sustaining themselves, of maintaining reserves, of treating even enemies with a baseline level of humanity, because the system could afford to do so without weakening itself. This was the lesson Klaus learned in that tent in January 1943. This was the lesson he carried for 51 years. This was the lesson he tried to pass on. That ideology is brittle and systems are durable. That abundance shared creates stability while scarcity hoarded creates conflict. That the true measure of a civilization isn't how it treats its friends, but how it treats its enemies when it has the power to destroy them. The coffee sat on his desk until the day he died. His children found it when they were cleaning out his office. They didn't understand why he kept it. It was just a tin of coffee beans, old and probably stale. But his oldest daughter, who'd heard the stories, understood. She kept the tin. She put it on her own desk. And when her children asked about it, she told them about their grandfather, about the war. about the moment when he'd been treated as human by people who could have left him to die, and about how that moment had changed everything. Because that's how transformation works, not in grand gestures or dramatic speeches, but in small, daily acts of mercy that compound over time. One warm meal, one clean bandage, one cup of coffee brewed fresh and taken for granted. These small things, multiplied by the millions, build a world where former enemies could become allies, where the devastation of war could be repaired, where a German soldier who believed he'd die in Stalingrad could instead live to see his grandchildren grow up in peace. The wind still carried ash in 1943, but in that tent, 30 kilometers west of Stalingrad, a different wind was blowing. The wind of systems that worked, of abundance that could be shared, of a future that wasn't inevitable, but was possible if people made the right choices. Klaus Hartmann felt that wind. He chose to follow it, and in that choice, in that moment, the war changed for him, not the war of armies and nations, but the war of ideas about what it means to be human, to be civilized, to build a world where coffee is always brewed fresh and mercy is always possible. That was the real victory, not just defeating fascism on the battlefield, but demonstrating that another way of living was possible. That cruelty wasn't strength. That generosity wasn't weakness. That a system built on abundance and care could outlast any system built on deprivation and ideology. The lesson was simple. The lesson was profound. The lesson was there in the coffee, in the clean bandages, in the morphine that stopped the screaming, in the doctor who saw wounds instead of enemies. Klaus understood it. He lived it. And in living it, he became proof that even the longest war eventually ends. But the choices we make during it echo forward into the peace that follows, shaping what we become, who we remember ourselves to be, and what we teach our children about the hard-won knowledge that freedom requires abundance, that democracy requires generosity, and that civilization requires the courage to treat even enemies as human beings, deserving of one warm meal, one clean bed, and one cup of real coffee brewed fresh each morning in a tent where the wind still carries ash. But the future is already being built.